Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the One Podcast where we go beyond the conference. I am Koen, an advisor for the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands, and I have the pleasure of being your host for this series. We are slicing through the program of the One Conference through all of the 8 themes, and the theme for today is Geopolitics. For Geopolitics, we are speaking with Cody Barrow, the CEO of EclecticIQ, who have held a talk at the One Conference here about digital sovereignty for Europe. Welcome, Cody.
Thanks a lot, Koen. Happy to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I am the CEO of a global cyber threat intelligence company based here in the Netherlands. We service large enterprises and national governments primarily with cyber threat intelligence services to help you understand your cyber threat landscape. For myself, which I think is really fundamental to what I've been discussing here at the One Conference, I'm actually an American running a European business. And so I come from the U.S. defense establishment. So I have been in intelligence for a bit over 20 years. Actually, I think almost 22 years. And the first half of that career was at the Pentagon, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I was a founding member of United States Cyber Command, which really, in many ways, was a very well-funded startup, a multi-billion-dollar startup. That was about 16, 17 years ago now, almost. Feels a lot more recent. And there, we were very concerned with retaining American sovereignty in cyberspace, right, from a national defense perspective. And that really defined the first half of my career. Now, the second half is in the private sector, where I've been a head of cyber threat intelligence for a very large financial. I've been a builder, and now, of course, I'm a CEO. And the last 5 years here in Europe bring me, hopefully, a lot of useful insight into how Europe can now preserve its own sovereignty.
Right, so you are an American and you're now living in Europe. So this gives you a really transatlantic perspective on this whole topic of sovereignty. Can you tell the people who were not able to be at your talk at the One Conference a little bit about, the short version of your talk, what it was about?
Yes. So my talk, Rearming Europe, Cyber Sovereignty Starts Now. Little bit of a humorous spin on that because I think cyber sovereignty really should have started when, I argue, effectively the 20th century ended, which was when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. That's where I think the post-World War II order that we have grown so used to truly dissolved. And I think that when the U.S. administration shifted over in January 2025, not a political statement, but an observation, we really saw the true closure of the last century. And so I think that in my talk, I focused on what sovereignty means. In other words, sovereignty is not about isolationism. I think you will never say never, but we are probably not returning to an isolationist world. Rather, sovereignty is about reducing dependencies, right? So reducing single points of failure in security, whether it's cybersecurity, national security, industrial security, economic security. And so in my perspective and in my talk, I covered that in order to avoid situations where European enterprises, so European businesses, European citizens, and European governments have to adhere to non-European values, laws, and norms, they must attain cybersecurity sovereignty and cyber sovereignty, meaning reduce dependencies on so much of the really US-based cloud infrastructure, email infrastructure, and security infrastructure that right now Europe is actually almost entirely dependent on. Yeah.
Yeah. So Europe is very dependent. But what are the risks for organizations with this dependency?
Yes. I think there are numerous risks. One of them is I would call a close call earlier this year. Some of the audience may be familiar with the incident when in, I don't know, maybe it was March or April, there was a member here in The Hague of one of the international bodies, and forgive me, I actually forget which organization, but
I think it was
there was
the International Criminal Court.
International Criminal Court. I think it was a senior member was unable to access his email, right?
Yeah.
And that was hosted on Microsoft's infrastructure. And to avoid spreading misinformation, I will clarify that my understanding is that this was inadvertent, although I don't really know for sure. But I think it woke everyone up to the possibility that the U.S. or another foreign administration could remove access to your own infrastructure if you don't have sovereignty. So that's one of the risks.
Right.
Another one of the risks is that when European services, European enterprises, European governments procure purely American solutions, they're sending economic value outside of Europe. Now, as an American citizen, I'm not going to say it's a bad thing for economic value to flow to the United States. And I think with the alliance that we still maintain, this is strong for the world economy. But I think that if Europe wants to stand on its own 2 feet, it is going to have to also look at its economic security, which means fostering innovation and supporting startup growth, scale-up growth, and general investment in security services, but also the broader technology sector.
Right. Can you also maybe elaborate a bit more on the espionage risk? So, for example, we a couple of years ago we decided we do not want Chinese equipment in our 5G networks because of the espionage risks, and now lately we're talking more about the United States as a dependency, and they also have the Patriot Act, which means, well, in my understanding, but I'm not a legal advisor, of course, but in some people explain it as all European data can be seen by the US government if they invoke the Patriot Act. So what are the risks there?
Well, I have to think carefully on this one because as a former national security agency,
Right.
I think so. It's not just the Patriot Act in the United States. It is the national security policy of the United States, which is openly available. If you search for Executive Order 12333, so 12333, you'll see the establishment policy document of the United States security apparatus. All public, decades old, and the bottom line up front is that the United States, like other nations, does conduct espionage, and it primarily conducts espionage against everyone except American citizens.
Right.
And so what this means is I can't really comment on if the U.S. security services have access to, say, European infrastructure, but I can say that if you're not sovereign, then you are risking that scenario. And I think I can actually go to the next level and remind the audience that in 2017, China passed its own intelligence law and revised it in 2020 to encompass Hong Kong that effectively grants Beijing jurisdiction over all technology services that are sufficiently connected to the People's Republic of China. So what that means is that if you are dependent on, say, a Chinese technology stack, or you are dependent on Chinese cloud services or Chinese cybersecurity services, then you are, by law, subjecting yourself by Chinese law to the Chinese national security apparatus. So that's a major risk.
Yeah, yeah. So we have this espionage, and so also the risk of being locked out of your own infrastructure, the sort of big red button scenario. And you mentioned the economic risks. If we can zoom a little bit in on the economic side. American big tech, they also have big sums of money. And whenever you have a European startup that seems to gain a foothold in digital services, American capital is there to buy it up, and it's not European anymore. It's American then. What can you tell us about that?
I think this is actually the underlying major factor. And speaking of China, as an example, if you read enough Chinese doctrine about how China views the world on a 100-year timescale, then you'll see the Chinese understand that when you're looking for military sovereignty and military independence, which I think with the invasion of Ukraine and the drone incursions we saw in September, that it's safe to say most of Europe is. China understands that you don't actually build a military first. You build economic supremacy, and the military follows. And that's really what happened with the United States, too. You can debate a little bit of the order of operations there, but ultimately, it's the economics that fuel military sovereignty. And if you try to go straight for military, then you have a situation like you saw in the Soviet Union, right, where they overspent on military and faced grave consequences. So all that to say that in order for Europe to really maintain sovereignty, for espionage reasons, for access reasons, and for security reasons, using military as a euphemism for security, it needs to have economic sovereignty. And so when you see American companies buying up European companies, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. This provides a return on investor capital. This provides funds into the European ecosystem. We are still, even though we are de-globalizing, we are still a globalized world to a large extent. But ultimately, you're not seeing the full fruits of that investment. And you're also not really building a European ecosystem or a new European defense industrial base that can truly compete for the next 15, 20 years and defend itself.
Right. So what needs to change in Europe to sort of protect and strengthen our own economy for that?
Fundamentally, the European Union is an economic union. And it is actually, as a student of political science, it is probably unlike anything we've seen in history, which makes it a remarkable project. But this also comes with negatives. It is not quite a confederation. It is not quite a federal entity. And so what this means is, as I think all of your audience probably knows, in the European Union, you have 27 fragmented member states, different languages, that's fine, but different regulatory policies, different procurement policies, different tax policies, and I think most importantly, no true unified capital market. So an example that I used at my talk at the One conference this week is we recently saw Swedish company Klarna go public for $28 billion. Excellent to see a European success. That also follows Spotify and some other European companies. But it went public on the New York Stock Exchange, not a European market. And something like a third or even less of European citizens invest in stocks, and when they do, it's often in the US markets, because there's no unified capital market here. So you need regulatory harmonization, a true unified single market, and startup simplification.
Right. So and a unified single market also means sort of a central stock exchange.
That's right. There's no EU stock exchange. So
Right.
I don't know if you invest in stocks, but you probably mostly invest in the Nasdaq or New York Stock Exchange. Maybe some on the German market for Rheinmetall, or okay, I shouldn't mention anyone, but someone that's doing well.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you're going to invest in American markets because there's really nowhere that you want to put your money in the European Union.
Yeah. So I want to take a look at a little bit of a more concrete example. One of the major topics regarding sovereignty in Europe is, or at least digital sovereignty, is the cloud. There are no real major European cloud providers. Or, well, maybe there is a French one which is gaining prominence, but such a European cloud provider, they're probably still running their data centers on, for example, American network devices or American systems. So is it really a European cloud then?
Controversial topic. I think it's not really. And I say this with all respect for Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. These are great companies. I have great friends there, and they're great products. That's why they're so dominant.
Yeah.
But I think that when you have a sovereign cloud, you can have all of the European citizens behind it. You can follow all of the European regulations, but you are still beholden to a CEO in Redmond or Mountain View or wherever, right?
Yeah.
And so once again, the transatlantic alliance is fractured but survives. And fundamentally, I think the economic interests are aligned between these two regions. So this is fine. But if you are really looking for true sovereignty, then you are ultimately reporting to the United States. I think that there are European cloud providers, and a lot of companies I speak with are using them. But they offer services well behind their American counterparts. And I think that speaks to the fundamental challenges of scaling in Europe, retaining talent in Europe. So something like 25 to 30% of immigrant unicorn tech founders in the United States are European. So I think that you would see an AWS, an Amazon Web Services, a Google Cloud truly grow here if you solve the economic problems. It all goes back to the economic reforms.
Right. So there's a little bit even of a brain drain going on of European talent. But might this also be, I mean, it comes to mind to me that a lot of people like to start up their businesses in the United States because of less regulations. Europe is infamous for over-regulating everything, right?
Well, you said overregulating, but
Okay.
yes, I think so. And I think the reason why they either start in the U.S. or move to the U.S. is because of all those challenges I mentioned. So when you start your business in Delaware or Virginia or Nevada, you have access to the world's largest market immediately. 50 states,
Yeah.
generally one set of overall harmonized regulations. I mean, there are some differences between states, but generally harmonized, and much simpler tax regime. You go on and on and on. Labor laws are more favorable to entrepreneurs as well. But I think there are solutions to this. So apart from the so-called 28th regime, so the reforms at the European Commission level that have been put forth, which I think hopefully we'll hear more about over the next few months. There are things that can be done at the member state level. For example, if there is an innovative company with less than, I don't know, 15, 20 million in revenue, primarily tech sector, primarily hires highly paid, highly skilled Europeans, there should be some exemptions for some of the labor protections, because usually these are employees who can find new jobs more easily, right?
Yeah.
And that allows those entrepreneurs to then operate with more speed, and agility, more similar to their American counterparts. I think this is generally at the member state level.
Right. So, your expertise regarding considering your background is obviously in the United States, and the discussion about sovereignty has really ramped up the last year because of, well, obvious changes in the United States. But Russia and China have far longer been, well, they're not an ally, of course. They have openly offensive cyber capabilities deployed against our interests. But the United States it's still an ally. You mentioned the alliance may fracture, but it will hold. But what is actually changing? What do you see changing in the next couple of years in this relationship?
I think the most serious change was presented clearly by Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference earlier in 2025, right? And that is the fundamental policy of the U.S. administration is America first. And I would advise the Europeans not to count on that being cyclical, because there are elections in the United States, and policies change, but policies change, right?
Yeah.
So I think that this should serve as the wake-up call that we have returned to the academic political science world of Hobbes, where every nation is out for itself. I would argue they always were, but I think it's a stark a reminder that in our modern world, after the as I said, after the end of the 20th century has truly ended in 2022, every nation or every bloc needs to focus on its own interests. The United States is leading the way on that. And so I think what's going to change is you'll see a much more transactional relationship. In other words, or as example, the European Commission announced Rearm Europe, which is the name of my talk. Also now it's, I think, /readiness 2030, which shows the length of the thinking. But and in Rearm Europe, the European Commission wants to allocate 800 billion euros to European defense in various areas, right? And the first thought of the American administration is, well, that's great for the U.S. And the Europeans will say, why is that? Why would that be good for you? We're trying to rearm and spend more. And they'll say, because you're going to buy American weapons, right?
Right.
But actually, it's the express policy, or it was, I think it's changed, not to do that. And I think that the Europeans need to focus on not necessarily isolating their supply chain, that's unrealistic, but on having native local capability and using some of those funds to build not just hardware like drones and things like that, but also cybersecurity services, and to sustain that sovereignty.
Right. So maybe a little bit of a tangent, but when I look at all kinds of digital services, in the end, there is no European alternative for an operating system. The only thing, if you don't want to depend on Redmond for your operating systems, it's open source, it's Linux. Do you think open source would be a solution in this situation?
So I have to caveat this one up front and say, I grew up online in the 90s. I grew up with information wants to be free.
Yes.
Some of your audience might remember Slashdot in the 90s or Usenet. Really passionate arguments and debates about free software. Not just free software, but also open source tenets. All of these sorts of idealistic worldviews. And I think that's wonderful. A lot of them emerged from Europe. Finland was obviously a huge leader. But I think that by embracing primarily open source, Europe risks undermining its own sovereignty, because I think sovereignty is fundamentally interconnected with economics. And I think that by embracing primarily open source, especially for security, Europe sidesteps the real challenge of trying to improve its economic situation and build something that can truly compete globally in a capitalist context, right? So I know not everybody views the world the same way. There's nothing wrong with that. But you need to also embrace a little bit of capitalism and a little bit of economic competition, or maybe a lot, to truly unseat non-European solutions and have that sovereignty. And I don't think open source fundamentally solves it.
So yeah, it all boils down to economics in
Economics.
your view. Yeah. So as we wrap up, do you have some final key insights you would like to give to our audience?
Well, during my presentation, somebody asked me what was different about the culture between the U.S. and Europe. And of course, this was a European who asked. Everybody understands Europe has many cultures, right? But what we're looking at is the business culture. And I think that there is no macro business culture. But I think fundamentally what's different is that in the U.S., there is the risk-taking gene, right? There is the risk-taking drive. American children, frankly, unfortunately, grow up knowing that they are taking on a risk when they walk to school, or if they're driven to school. They take on risks all the time from an early age. Don't talk to strangers. Don't do this. Don't do that. European children may have some of that, but ultimately, it's a safer place to be. It's a less risky place to be. Hopefully, it stays that way for a very long time, right? Yeah. But in the U.S., investors, in going back to economics, understand the power law. They understand they're going to throw their bets behind 100 startups. 99 of them are going to fail, or 90 are going to fail. 9 are going to be middling. They'll maybe get, they'll zero it out, and 1 is going to be Klarna, right? European investors sometimes understand that, but they more often, it hurts them when they don't see the sort of scale from every one of their babies. And they need to start to accept those risks. And I would close by saying, fundamentally, I don't have the answer politically as to what the European Union should do. I don't have the answer about further federalization or less federalization. I have my personal view. But no matter what it does, the European Union needs to embrace its fighting spirit. It's like an elephant that's rising. It takes a long time, but once it's up, it's up. So embrace the European spirit. Find the European spirit. Wake it up again.
Find the European spirit and wake it up again.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Cody Barrow, for being with us.
Thank you.
If you are curious about the talk Cody gave at the One Conference, there will be a summary and the slides of his session available on the website one-conference.nl. The theme for next week will be Future of Cybersecurity. And all of you OT people who have been waiting for OT at the One Podcast, you can eat your heart out next week with Boya Tranum from DMV talking about offshore wind farms. You can find that episode and all others of the One Podcast on any platform wherever you do your podcasts, and follow us on LinkedIn, the One Conference on LinkedIn, where you will get notified when the next episode goes online. So I will happily see you next week.